My name is Tobias Renaker, and I am an archivist who survived the first 90 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted 3 months ago, I made the fatal decision to stay behind at the National Archives while America froze to death around me. I watched our government abandon us, our infrastructure collapse, and civilization crumble while I fought to preserve what remained of human history. What I discovered in those classified documents changed everything I thought I knew about survival and betrayal. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Tobias Renaker, and I am an archivist who survived the first 90 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted 3 months ago, I made the fatal decision to stay behind at the National Archives while America froze to death around me. I watched our government abandon us, our infrastructure collapse, and civilization crumble while I fought to preserve what remained of human history. What I discovered in those classified documents changed everything I thought I knew about survival and betrayal. I suppose I should start at the beginning, back when I still believed the world made sense. July 15th, 2024 started like any other Tuesday morning at the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland. I had been working there for 8 years as a senior digital archivist, and my job was exactly as boring as it sounds. Every day I would arrive at 7:30 in the morning, badge into the climate-controlled building, and spend my time digitizing old government documents that nobody wanted to read. Most people thought my job was pointless. My colleagues would joke that I was the guy who organized the government's junk drawer. But I knew better. I understood that those forgotten files, those dusty emergency protocols, those classified reports buried in basement storage rooms, they were the real history of America. Not the sanitized versions you read in textbooks, but the raw, unfiltered truth of how our government actually worked when nobody was watching. My obsession with preserving these documents came from my mixed heritage. My father was a third-generation German-American whose family had lost everything during World War II, and my mother was a Filipino-American whose family had fled the Philippines during martial law. Both sides of my family had learned the hard way that when governments fall, the first thing that disappears is the truth. Documents get burned, records get destroyed, and history gets rewritten by whoever survives. I swore that would never happen on my watch. That morning, I was working on digitizing a collection of Civil War medical records when the emergency broadcast system activated on every screen in the building. The automated voice was calm and clinical, but the words it spoke changed everything. Yellowstone caldera has experienced a catastrophic eruption. All residents within 500 miles must evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. I remember staring at the screen in disbelief. Yellowstone had been rumbling for weeks, but the United States Geological Survey had classified it as normal geothermal activity. I knew this because I had been working on a project cataloging USGS volcanic threat assessments for the past 6 months. Yellowstone kept appearing in those files as a low-probability, catastrophic impact event, the kind of disaster that happened once every 100,000 years, not the kind that happened on a random Tuesday morning while I was scanning medical records from 1863. Within minutes, every phone in the building was ringing. Emergency management coordinators were calling from FEMA, the Department of Homeland Security, the Pentagon. I watched my supervisors scramble to activate protocols I had helped digitize years earlier. Suddenly, those boring emergency procedures were not theoretical anymore. They were our lifeline. The first reports coming in were confusing and contradictory. The eruption had occurred at 6:47 in the morning Mountain Time, sending an ash column 50 miles into the atmosphere. The initial blast had been heard as far away as Denver. Seismographs across the western United States were recording earthquake activity unlike anything in recorded history. But what terrified me most were the temperature readings. I had access to the National Weather Service's emergency database, and I was watching temperature station across the western United States report drops that should have been impossible. In the span of 3 hours, temperatures in Wyoming had dropped 20 degrees. In 6 hours, ash clouds were visible from satellites over Colorado and Utah. By noon Eastern Time, weather models were predicting that the ash would reach the East Coast within 48 hours. This was when I realized that my years of cataloging disaster response protocols had given me a unique perspective on what was happening. I had read classified reports about volcanic winter scenarios, theoretical studies about what would happen if a supervolcano erupted in the modern era. The models were terrifying, but they had always been academic exercises. Now they were becoming reality in real time. My colleague Dr. Sarah Chen from the Preservation Department found me in the Digital Archives room around 2 o'clock that afternoon. She was a brilliant woman in her early 40s who had spent 15 years developing new techniques for preserving historical documents. She looked pale and shaken as she approached my workstation. She asked me if I had seen the latest reports from the Emergency Management Agency. I told her I had been monitoring everything through our emergency channels. She sat down heavily in the chair next to mine and said something that I will never forget. She said that her brother worked for the National Science Foundation and had called her 20 minutes earlier. According to his contacts at the USGS, the eruption was worse than anything being reported to the public. The ash cloud was not dissipating the way computer models predicted. Instead, it was growing larger and moving faster than anyone had anticipated. I pulled up the classified volcanic threat assessments I had been working with and showed her the worst-case scenarios. The files described something called a volcanic winter, where ash particles in the atmosphere would block sunlight for months or even years. Global temperatures would drop by 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Crop failures would be inevitable. The reports estimated that such an event could kill more people than World War II. Dr. Chen stared at the screen for a long time before asking me how accurate these models were. I told her they were based on historical precedents like the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which had caused the year without a summer and led to global famine. But those eruptions had happened in a pre-industrial world. Nobody knew what would happen if a supervolcano erupted in an interconnected global economy, dependent on just-in-time supply chains and electronic infrastructure. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, evacuation orders were being issued for all non-essential government personnel. Our building director called an emergency meeting in the main conference room. There were maybe 30 people left in the building by that point. Most of the day shift had already left to check on their families or had been sent home early. The director explained that the National Archives had been classified as a non-essential facility for the purposes of the emergency response. All personnel were being given permission to evacuate immediately. However, he also explained that someone needed to remain behind to protect the archives and maintain the building's climate control systems. The documents we housed, including the original Constitution and Declaration of Independence, were irreplaceable national treasures that required constant environmental monitoring. I volunteered immediately. Dr. Chen volunteered as well, along with 2 security guards, Marcus Thompson and Robert Williams. Marcus was a retired Army sergeant who had been working at the archives for 12 years. Robert was younger, maybe 28, and had been hired just 6 months earlier. Both men had families, but they understood the importance of what we were protecting. The director seemed relieved that someone was willing to stay, but he also looked worried. He told us that the emergency protocols called for the skeleton crew to maintain communication with emergency management headquarters and to follow evacuation procedures if the situation deteriorated further. He handed me a sealed envelope containing emergency contact information and override codes for the building systems. As the rest of the staff filed out of the conference room, I felt a strange mix of pride and dread. I was proud that I had been trusted with protecting America's most important historical documents. But I was also increasingly worried about what those classified reports had told me about volcanic winters. If the models were correct, we were not dealing with a regional disaster that would be over in a few weeks. We were dealing with a global climate catastrophe that could last for years. That evening, I stood in the archive's main reading room and watched the sunset through the reinforced windows. The sky had an unusual orange tint, and I could see a faint haze on the horizon. The ash cloud was still over 1,000 miles away, but it was already changing the way light traveled through the atmosphere. I thought about all the historical documents surrounding me, all the records of previous disasters and government responses. For the first time in my career, I was not just reading about history, I was living it. Dr. Chen joined me at the window around 7 o'clock. She had been monitoring the emergency radio frequencies and had some disturbing news. Reports were coming in of massive traffic jams on highways leading away from the western states. The interstate system was becoming gridlocked as millions of people tried to evacuate simultaneously. Several airports had been shut down due to ash contamination in jet engines. The federal government was activating emergency shelters, but there were not enough resources to handle the scale of the displacement. More troubling were the reports from international sources. The ash cloud was affecting weather patterns across the Pacific. Temperature readings from weather stations in Canada were showing unusual drops. European meteorologists were predicting that the ash would reach the Atlantic within a week. This was not just an American disaster anymore. It was becoming a global emergency. I spent that night in my office, reading through every file I could find about volcanic winters and government disaster response. The more I read, the more concerned I became. The historical precedents were clear. When supervolcanoes erupted, they did not just cause local destruction. They changed global climate patterns for years. The 1815 Tambora eruption had caused crop failures and famine across Europe and North America. The Toba eruption, 74,000 years ago, had nearly driven humans to extinction. But those eruptions had happened in pre-industrial societies. In 2024, we were completely dependent on systems that had never been tested against a volcanic winter. Our electrical grid was designed for normal weather patterns. Our transportation networks assumed that highways and airports would remain functional. Our food system relied on predictable growing seasons and just-in-time delivery. None of these systems had backup plans for a world where the sun was blocked by ash for months at a time. The classified files I was reading contained some contingency plans, but they were incomplete and theoretical. There were maps of emergency supply depots and communication protocols for maintaining government operations during extended disasters. But the plans seemed to assume that the disaster would be temporary, that normal operations could resume within weeks or months. I was beginning to suspect that assumption was wrong. By the second day, July 16th, the ash cloud had reached the Mississippi River. I could see it from our windows, a dark gray mass that stretched across the entire western horizon. The temperature outside had dropped 8 degrees since the previous morning. The National Weather Service was predicting that the ash would reach Maryland by the following evening. The emergency radio frequencies were becoming increasingly chaotic. State emergency management agencies were reporting that they were overwhelmed by the number of evacuees. FEMA was activating emergency shelters, but they were reaching capacity within hours of opening. The Red Cross was setting up temporary camps, but they did not have enough supplies for the millions of people who were fleeing the affected areas. More disturbing were the reports from the areas closest to the eruption. Communication with most of Wyoming had been lost completely. The few reports getting through described a landscape covered in several feet of ash, with temperatures dropping below freezing even in the middle of July. Emergency responders were having difficulty reaching affected areas because the ash was too thick for helicopters to fly and too deep for ground vehicles to navigate. I was beginning to understand that we were not dealing with a normal disaster that would be over in a few days or weeks. The ash cloud was not dissipating the way computer models had predicted. Instead, it was growing larger and spreading faster. The temperature drops were more severe than anyone had anticipated. The infrastructure damage was more extensive than emergency planners had prepared for. That afternoon, I made a decision that would define the next 3 months of my life. I began systematically copying the most important emergency protocols and government installation maps to portable hard drives. If the situation continued to deteriorate, I wanted to make sure that critical information would survive even if the building's systems failed. I focused on documents that would be useful for survival and reconstruction. Maps of military installations, supply depot locations, emergency communication frequencies, and disaster response protocols. Dr. Chen found me working late that evening and asked what I was doing. I explained my concerns about the long-term implications of the volcanic winter. She listened carefully as I walked her through the historical precedents and the classified threat assessments. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said that she had been thinking the same thing. The disaster was worse than anyone was admitting publicly, and it was going to last much longer than anyone was prepared for. She had been in contact with her brother throughout the day, and he had shared some information that was not being released to the public. The eruption had been more powerful than initially reported. The ash column had reached the stratosphere, which meant that the particles would remain in the atmosphere for months or years rather than settling out within weeks. Preliminary climate models were predicting a global temperature drop of 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which would effectively trigger an ice age. We decided to work together to preserve as much critical information as possible. Over the next 3 days, we systematically copied thousands of documents to multiple backup drives. We focused on information that would be useful for survival and reconstruction. Emergency protocols, supply depot locations, communication frequencies, infrastructure maps, and historical precedents for societal collapse and recovery. By July 19th, the ash cloud had reached the East Coast. I watched from the archive windows as the sky turned an ominous gray color and the first ash particles began falling like snow. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 3 days. The National Weather Service was predicting the first frost warnings for Maryland in July, something that had never happened in recorded history. The emergency radio frequencies were reporting increasingly desperate situations across the country. Major highways were becoming impassable due to ash accumulation. Airports were shutting down as ash contaminated jet engines. The electrical grid was experiencing brownouts as ash interfered with power lines and solar panels. Most disturbing, early reports were coming in of crop failures across the Midwest as ash blocked sunlight and temperatures dropped below growing thresholds. I realized that we were witnessing the collapse of modern civilization in real time. The interconnected systems that made our society function were failing simultaneously. Transportation networks, communication systems, power grids, and food distribution were all breaking down within days of each other. The government's emergency response plans had been designed for regional disasters, not for a global catastrophe that affected every system simultaneously. On July 20th, 5 days after the eruption, I received the last official communication from our headquarters. The message was brief and ominous. All non-essential government facilities were being closed indefinitely. Personnel were instructed to evacuate immediately and report to designated emergency shelters. The National Archives was being classified as a non-essential facility for the duration of the emergency. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to process what it meant. The government was abandoning the National Archives. They were abandoning the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and 250 years of American history. They were treating our most important historical documents as non-essential, but I also understood why they were making this decision. The government was facing an unprecedented crisis. Millions of people were displaced and needed immediate assistance. Infrastructure was failing across the country. Emergency resources were stretched beyond their limits. In the face of such overwhelming need, protecting historical documents seemed like a luxury they could not afford. Dr. Chen, Marcus, and Robert gathered in my office that evening to discuss our options. We could follow the evacuation order and abandon the archives, or we could stay and try to protect the documents for as long as possible. The decision was not easy. We all had families and friends who were dealing with the crisis. We all understood the personal risks of staying behind, but we also understood what we would be abandoning. The original Constitution and Declaration of Independence were housed in our building. So were the Louisiana Purchase documents, the Emancipation Proclamation, and millions of other records that defined American history. If we left, there was no guarantee that anyone would come back for them. If the building's climate control systems failed, centuries of irreplaceable documents would be destroyed within months. Marcus spoke first. He said that he had spent 12 years protecting these documents, and he was not going to abandon them now. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and understood the importance of protecting what mattered most. Robert agreed, saying that he had taken an oath to protect the archives, and he intended to honor that commitment. Dr. Chen was more conflicted. She had elderly parents in California who were in the evacuation zone. She wanted to go to them, but she also understood the irreplaceable nature of what we were protecting. Finally, she decided to stay for at least another week to help us stabilize the building's systems and preserve the most critical documents. I made my decision based on something I had learned from my family's history. My grandmother had told me stories about the destruction of historical records during World War II and the martial law period in the Philippines. She had seen how quickly centuries of history could be lost when governments fell and societies collapsed. I was not going to let that happen to America's historical record, not if I could prevent it. That night, I composed a message to my supervisors explaining our decision to remain at the archives. I told them that we understood the risks and that we were prepared to follow evacuation procedures if the situation became untenable. I also requested that they maintain communication with us and provide updates on the emergency situation. I never received a response to that message. The next morning, July 21st, I woke up to find that the ash fall had increased dramatically overnight. There was nearly an inch of gray ash covering everything outside the building. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. The emergency radio frequencies were reporting that the ash was causing respiratory problems for millions of people, and that hospitals were being overwhelmed by patients with breathing difficulties. More troubling were the reports about infrastructure failures. The ash was interfering with electronic systems across the country. Cell phone towers were failing. Internet connectivity was becoming sporadic. The electrical grid was experiencing rolling blackouts as ash accumulated on power lines and solar panels. The transportation system was grinding to a halt as ash made roads impassable and contaminated vehicle engines. I spent that day monitoring emergency communications and documenting what I was witnessing. I understood that I was observing the collapse of modern American civilization, and I felt a responsibility to record what was happening for future generations. If we survived this disaster, people would need to understand how it had unfolded and what had gone wrong. The classified files I had been reading painted a clear picture of what was happening. The volcanic winter was beginning exactly as the models had predicted. The ash particles in the atmosphere were blocking sunlight, causing global temperatures to drop rapidly. The effects were cascading through every system that modern society depended on. We were experiencing the kind of civilizational collapse that had only been theoretical until now. By the end of the first week, I thought I had seen the worst of it. The The ash clouds were dissipating, the initial panic was settling, and I figured we would be back to normal in a month. I could not have been more wrong about what was coming next. What I did not understand on day 7 was that the ash clouds were not the disaster. They were just the beginning. The real catastrophe was what happened after the ash settled, when the sun disappeared behind a gray veil that would not lift for months. I had read about volcanic winters in those classified files, but reading about something and living through it are completely different experiences. The science behind volcanic winter is actually quite simple, though the implications are terrifying. When a supervolcano erupts, it sends billions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. The ash eventually falls back to Earth, but the sulfur dioxide forms tiny droplets that can remain suspended in the atmosphere for years. These droplets reflect sunlight back into space, effectively dimming the sun and cooling the planet. The larger the eruption, the more dramatic the cooling effect. Yellowstone had been the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The sulfur dioxide it had injected into the stratosphere was creating a global cooling effect that would last for years, not months. I knew this from the classified climate models I had been studying, but it took several days for the reality to become apparent to everyone else. Day 8 was when I first noticed that something was fundamentally wrong with the weather. The ash fall had mostly stopped, but the sky remained an unnatural gray color. The sun was barely visible through the haze, appearing as a dim orange disk that provided almost no warmth. The temperature had dropped another 3 degrees overnight, and the National Weather Service was reporting similar drops across the entire continent. I spent that morning monitoring emergency communications from my office in the archives. The reports were becoming increasingly alarming. Crop failures were being reported across the Midwest as temperatures dropped below critical thresholds for corn and wheat. Livestock were dying from respiratory problems caused by ash inhalation. Emergency shelters were becoming overcrowded as millions of evacuees had nowhere else to go. Dr. Chen joined me in the communications room around 10 o'clock that morning. She had been monitoring international news feeds and had some disturbing information. The cooling effect was not limited to North America. Temperature drops were being reported across Europe, Asia, and even the Southern Hemisphere. The volcanic winter was becoming a global phenomenon much faster than anyone had anticipated. She showed me satellite images that had been released by NASA the previous evening. The sulfur dioxide cloud from Yellowstone had spread across the entire northern hemisphere and was beginning to affect weather patterns in the southern hemisphere as well. Climate scientists were predicting that global temperatures would drop by 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit within the next 3 months. That kind of temperature drop would effectively trigger an ice age. The implications were staggering. Modern agriculture was completely dependent on stable weather patterns and predictable growing seasons. A 10-degree temperature drop would make it impossible to grow crops across vast areas of the planet. Billions of people would face starvation. The global economy, which was based on just-in-time delivery and international trade, would collapse completely. I pulled up the historical precedents I had been studying and showed Dr. Chen what had happened during previous volcanic winters. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora had caused global crop failures and famine. The year 1816 had been known as the year without a summer, with snow falling in July across New England and crop failures across Europe. But that eruption had been much smaller than Yellowstone, and it had occurred in a pre-industrial world with a much smaller population. By day 10, the temperature drops were becoming impossible to ignore. We were experiencing the coldest July on record, with daytime temperatures barely reaching 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The emergency radio frequencies were reporting that heating systems across the country were being turned on in the middle of summer. Air conditioning usage had dropped to zero, replaced by heating costs that were straining electrical grids already damaged by ash contamination. The building's climate control systems were struggling to maintain the precise temperature and humidity levels required to preserve historical documents. The National Archives had been designed to maintain a constant temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit with 45% humidity. But the external temperature drops were making it increasingly difficult and expensive to maintain these conditions. Marcus Thompson, our security supervisor, approached me that afternoon with a troubling report. He had been monitoring the building's mechanical systems and had noticed some concerning trends. The heating system was running constantly, consuming far more energy than normal. The backup generators were being tested more frequently as the electrical grid became increasingly unreliable. Most importantly, our fuel supplies for the emergency generators were being depleted much faster than anticipated. I asked Marcus how long our emergency fuel supplies would last if we continued operating at current consumption levels. He calculated that we had maybe 3 weeks of fuel remaining, assuming the electrical grid continued to provide primary power. If we had to rely entirely on generators, our fuel would last less than a week. This was our first indication that we might not be able to maintain the building's climate control systems indefinitely. Dr. Chen and I spent the next several days conducting an inventory of our critical systems and supplies. We had emergency food for about 2 weeks, enough to sustain 4 people at normal consumption levels. We had water purification tablets and access to the building's emergency water reserves. We had communication equipment and access to emergency radio frequencies. But we did not have enough fuel to run the climate control systems for more than a few weeks. The real problem was that we had never planned for an extended emergency. The building's emergency protocols assumed that normal operations would resume within days or weeks. There were no procedures for maintaining the archives during a multi-year crisis. We were making it up as we went along, using our knowledge of historical precedents and emergency protocols to guide our decisions. By day 15, we were experiencing the first snowfall in Maryland in July. I watched from the archive windows as large flakes drifted down from the gray sky, covering the parking lot and surrounding buildings in a thin layer of white. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, making it the coldest July day in recorded history. The National Weather Service was predicting that temperatures would continue to drop for the next several months. The emergency radio frequencies were reporting increasingly desperate situations across the country. Major cities were experiencing power outages as electrical grids failed under the strain of unprecedented heating demands. Food shortages were becoming widespread as transportation networks broke down and supply chains collapsed. Hospitals were overwhelmed by patients suffering from respiratory problems, hypothermia, and malnutrition. Most disturbing were the reports from rural areas. Small towns across the Midwest were being abandoned as residents fled to emergency shelters in larger cities. Agricultural communities that had existed for generations were being evacuated as crop failures made it impossible to sustain local populations. The rural infrastructure that had supported American agriculture for centuries was collapsing within weeks. I was beginning to understand that we were witnessing the end of the world as we knew it. The interconnected systems that had made modern civilization possible were failing simultaneously. The global economy was collapsing. Governments were losing control of their territories. Millions of people were being displaced. The social order that had existed for decades was dissolving in real time. On day 18, we received our last communication from FEMA headquarters. The message was brief and ominous. All government facilities were being prioritized based on their critical importance to emergency response operations. The National Archives had been classified as a non-critical facility. No further support or communication should be expected until normal operations could resume. I read the message several times, trying to process what it meant. The government was abandoning us completely. They were cutting off all communication and support. We were on our own, with no backup plan and no way to contact the outside world except through emergency radio frequencies. The four of us were now solely responsible for protecting 250 years of American history with no support from anyone. Dr. Chen was visibly shaken by the message. She had been hoping to hear from her family in California, but all civilian communication networks had been down for over a week. She had no idea whether her parents were safe or whether they had been evacuated successfully. The isolation was becoming as difficult to bear as the physical hardships. Marcus and Robert took the news more stoically. They had both served in the military and understood that sometimes you were expected to complete your mission without support from headquarters. But I could see the concern in their eyes. We were facing a situation that none of us had been trained for, with resources that were rapidly being depleted. That night, I made a decision that would define the next several weeks of our survival. I began systematically copying the most critical government documents to multiple backup drives. I focused on information that would be useful for survival and reconstruction after the crisis. Maps of military installations, supply depot locations, emergency communication frequencies, and disaster response protocols. If we did not survive, I wanted to make sure that this information would be preserved for whoever found it. By day 20, the Potomac River was beginning to freeze. I could see ice forming along the riverbanks from the archive windows. The temperature had dropped to 35 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and was falling below freezing at night. The National Weather Service was predicting that the river would be completely frozen within a week, something that had not happened since the 1800s. The implications were staggering. The Potomac River was a major transportation route and water source for millions of people in the Washington metropolitan area. If it froze completely, it would cut off one of the last remaining supply routes to the capital region. Barge traffic, which had been maintaining some level of commerce despite the collapse of road and rail networks, would come to a complete halt. I spent that day monitoring emergency communications from across the region. The reports were uniformly grim. Arlington and Alexandria were experiencing rolling blackouts as their electrical grids failed. Washington, D.C. was implementing martial law as social order broke down. The federal government was evacuating non-essential personnel from the capital region and consolidating operations in underground bunkers. The evacuation of the federal government was particularly troubling. I had access to classified protocols for government continuity operations, and I knew that the evacuation procedures were only supposed to be used in the most extreme circumstances. Nuclear war, massive terrorist attacks, or complete societal collapse. The fact that these procedures were being implemented meant that the government considered the volcanic winter to be an existential threat to the United States. Dr. Chen approached me that evening with a proposal that would change everything. She had been thinking about our situation and had reached a troubling conclusion. The building's climate control systems were failing, our fuel supplies were nearly exhausted, and we had no support from the outside world. If we stayed much longer, we would likely die from hypothermia or starvation. But if we left, we would be abandoning irreplaceable historical documents to certain destruction. She proposed that we focus our efforts on preserving the most critical documents while we still could. We would digitize everything possible and create multiple backup copies. We would seal the most important physical documents in protective containers. We would document everything we were doing so that future generations would understand what had happened and why. Then, when our supplies were exhausted, we would evacuate and try to survive in the outside world. I understood the logic of her proposal, but I also understood what it meant. We would be abandoning the original Constitution and Declaration of Independence. We would be leaving behind millions of documents that could never be replaced. We would be accepting that American history, as preserved in physical form, would likely be destroyed by the climate disaster we were experiencing. Marcus and Robert were more pragmatic about the situation. They pointed out that we had already exceeded our original mission parameters by staying as long as we had. The government had ordered us to evacuate weeks ago. Our families and friends were dealing with the crisis and might need our help. We had done everything we could to protect the archives, but we also had a responsibility to preserve ourselves. Day 25 brought the first major mechanical failure in the building. The primary heating system shut down due to a combination of fuel exhaustion and mechanical stress from operating far beyond its normal parameters. The backup heating system was able to maintain minimal temperatures, but we were now entirely dependent on our emergency generators for power. The temperature inside the building dropped to 50 degrees Fahrenheit within hours. I could see frost forming on the windows of the archive storage areas. The humidity levels were dropping rapidly as the air became too cold to hold moisture. These were exactly the conditions that would cause irreparable damage to historical documents. Paper would become brittle and crack. Ink would fade. Leather bindings would dry out and crumble. I spent that day in the main document storage area, watching centuries of American history slowly deteriorate in front of my eyes. The original copies of the Louisiana Purchase documents were showing signs of stress. The Emancipation Proclamation was beginning to curl at the edges. Even the specially protected Constitution and Declaration of Independence were at risk if the temperature continued to drop. Dr. Chen joined me in the storage area around noon. She had been monitoring the building's environmental systems and had some devastating news. The backup heating system was consuming our remaining fuel supplies at an unsustainable rate. We had maybe 5 days of fuel remaining before the system would shut down completely. After that, the building would reach external temperatures within hours. We spent the next 3 days in a desperate race against time. We worked 18-hour shifts to digitize as many documents as possible. We created multiple backup copies of everything and stored them in different locations throughout the building. We sealed the most critical physical documents in protective containers with emergency heating packs. We documented everything we were doing and why we were doing it. The work was exhausting and heartbreaking. Every document we could not save felt like a personal failure. Every backup system that failed felt like another step toward disaster. The weight of responsibility was crushing. We were 4 people trying to preserve the historical record of an entire nation, and we were failing. On day 28, the backup heating system finally shut down. The temperature inside the building began dropping immediately. Within 6 hours, it had reached external temperatures of 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice was forming on the walls and windows. Our breath was visible in the air. The archive storage areas were becoming uninhabitable. I made one final trip to the main document storage area to check on the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. They were housed in specially designed cases that provided some protection from temperature and humidity changes, but even these cases were not designed for extreme cold. I could see condensation forming inside the cases as the temperature dropped. The documents that had survived for over 200 years were being destroyed by the climate disaster we were experiencing. Marcus found me standing in front of the Constitution case around 8 o'clock that evening. He did not say anything, but I could see the understanding in his eyes. We had done everything we could. We had exceeded our mission parameters and risked our lives to protect these documents. But we had reached the limits of what was possible. If we stayed any longer, we would die, and the documents would be destroyed anyway. Dr. Chen and Robert joined us in the storage area a few minutes later. We stood together in the freezing air, looking at the documents that had defined American democracy for over 2 centuries. The irony was not lost on any of us. We were watching the physical foundation of American government freeze to death at the same time that American society was collapsing outside. That night, we made the decision to begin evacuation procedures. We would spend the next 2 days gathering our digitized records and emergency supplies. We would seal the building as securely as possible and activate the emergency preservation protocols. Then we would leave the National Archives and try to survive in the frozen wasteland that America had become. But before we could leave, I discovered something that would change everything we thought we knew about the government's response to the crisis. Hidden in a classified section of the archives that I had never had clearance to access before, I found a file that proved the government had known this could happen. They had plans, they had resources, they had maps to survival, and they had abandoned us all to die. Day 30 was when I found the file that changed everything. Buried in a classified section I had never had clearance for before, there were documents that proved the government knew this could happen. They had plans, they had resources, they had maps to survival, and they had left us all behind. The file was labeled Operation Deep Freeze, and it was buried so deep in the classified archives that I had never even known it existed. The security clearance required to access these documents was far above my level. But the building's emergency protocols had automatically unlocked all security restrictions when the primary systems failed. What I found inside that file shattered everything I thought I knew about our government and our situation. Operation Deep Freeze was a comprehensive contingency plan for exactly what we were experiencing. A volcanic winter scenario that would trigger global climate collapse and societal breakdown. The file contained detailed studies of supervolcano threats, climate modeling for various eruption scenarios, and step-by-step procedures for maintaining government operations during an extended ice age. The documents were dated from 2018, meaning the government had been planning for this possibility for over 6 years. The scope of the planning was staggering. There were maps of underground bunker complexes that could house thousands of government personnel and their families. There were supply depot locations containing food, fuel, medical supplies, and emergency equipment sufficient to sustain operations for years. There were communication networks designed to function independently of civilian infrastructure. There were even protocols for maintaining genetic seed banks and preserving critical industrial capabilities. But what made me physically sick was the population projections. The planners had calculated that a Yellowstone eruption would likely kill between 60 and 80% of the American population within the first year. They had determined that attempting to save everyone would be impossible and would likely result in total governmental collapse. Instead, they had designed Operation Deep Freeze to preserve essential government functions and a small core population that could eventually rebuild civilization. The civilian population had been classified into different priority categories. Essential government personnel and their families were Priority 1, guaranteed access to underground shelters and supply depots. Critical infrastructure workers like power plant operators and military personnel were Priority 2, given secondary access to emergency resources. Everyone else, including the millions of people currently freezing to death across America, had been classified as Priority 3, expendable. Dr. Chen found me reading the Operation Deep Freeze files around 3 o'clock in the morning on day 31. I had been awake for over 20 hours, systematically copying every document I could find. She took one look at my face and knew that something terrible had happened. When I showed her the files, she went completely silent for several minutes. Then she asked me if I understood what this meant. I told her I understood exactly what it meant. Our government had known that Yellowstone could erupt and trigger a volcanic winter. They had spent years planning for this scenario. They had built underground shelters and stockpiled supplies. They had developed communication networks and preservation protocols. And they had made a deliberate decision to abandon 90% of the American population to save themselves and maintain power. The evacuation of the federal government that we had witnessed was not a panicked response to an unexpected disaster. It was the implementation of a carefully planned operation that had been years in the making. When they classified the National Archives as non-essential and cut off our communication, They were not making a difficult decision under pressure. They were following predetermined protocols that had written us off as expendable. Dr. Chen asked me how many people knew about Operation Deep Freeze. I told her that based on the security classifications and distribution lists, probably fewer than 100 people in the entire government had access to the complete plan. The president, key cabinet members, military leadership, and select intelligence officials. Everyone else, including most members of Congress, had been kept in the dark about the true scope of the government's disaster planning. The moral implications were staggering. While millions of Americans were struggling to survive in emergency shelters with inadequate food and heating, government officials and their families were living comfortably in underground bunkers with years of supplies. While civilian communication networks had collapsed, the government was maintaining secure communications through hidden networks. While hospitals were overwhelmed and people were dying from preventable causes, government personnel had access to fully equipped medical facilities. I spent the next several hours reading through the operational details of the bunker complexes. The primary facility was located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, built into a series of natural caves and expanded with military engineering. It could house up to 5,000 people for up to 10 years, with renewable power systems, hydroponic food production, and complete manufacturing capabilities. Secondary facilities were scattered across the country, each designed to maintain regional government operations during the crisis. The supply depot networks were equally impressive. Hundreds of hidden locations contained emergency food, fuel, medical supplies, and equipment. The locations were carefully chosen to be accessible even during extreme weather conditions, and were stocked with vehicles specifically designed for operation in volcanic winter environments. Each depot contained enough supplies to sustain a small group for months, and they were connected by secure communication networks that allowed for coordination and resource sharing. But the most disturbing aspect of Operation Deep Freeze was the timeline for reestablishing government control. The planners had calculated that the volcanic winter would last between 3 and 5 years, during which time the civilian population would be drastically reduced through starvation, disease, and social breakdown. They had planned to emerge from their bunkers after the crisis had eliminated what they considered excess population and reestablish government control over the survivors. The files contained detailed studies of historical precedents for population reduction during climate disasters. The planners had studied the Black Death, the Irish potato famine, and other catastrophes that had killed large percentages of affected populations. They had concluded that such events, while tragic, often led to improved living conditions for survivors and more sustainable population levels. They viewed the volcanic winter as an opportunity to reset American society on what they considered a more sustainable foundation. Marcus found us in the archives room around 6 o'clock that morning. He had been wondering why we were awake all night and had come to check on us. When we showed him the Operation Deep Freeze files, his reaction was immediate and visceral. As a retired Army sergeant, he understood military planning and logistics. He also understood betrayal when he saw it. He told us that during his military service, he had occasionally heard rumors about deep underground facilities and secret supply networks. He had always assumed they were conspiracy theories or highly classified military projects related to nuclear war planning. He had never imagined that they were part of a deliberate plan to abandon the civilian population during a natural disaster. Robert Williams, our younger security guard, had a different reaction when we briefed him on our discovery. He was angry, but he was also practical. He pointed out that, regardless of the government's moral failures, the information we had discovered could be invaluable for our survival. The maps of supply depots and safe houses could help us navigate the frozen wasteland outside. The communication frequencies could help us contact other survivors. The operational procedures could guide our own survival planning. I realized that Robert was right, but I also understood the broader implications of what we had discovered. We were not just four people trying to survive a natural disaster. We were witnesses to a massive betrayal of the American people by their own government. We had documentation proving that our leaders had planned to abandon millions of citizens to save themselves. This information needed to be preserved and eventually shared with any survivors who emerged from the crisis. Over the next 2 days, I systematically copied every Operation Deep Freeze document I could find. The files contained thousands of pages of planning documents, maps, supply lists, and operational procedures. I created multiple backup copies and stored them in different locations throughout our equipment. If we survived the crisis, this information would be crucial for understanding what had happened and holding the responsible parties accountable. The building's temperature continued to drop during those days. By day 33, the internal temperature had reached 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice was forming on the walls and windows. Our breath created clouds of vapor that froze and fell to the floor. The archive storage areas were becoming dangerous to enter without protective clothing, and we were running low on warm clothes and emergency heating supplies. Dr. Chen was developing signs of hypothermia despite our efforts to stay warm. Her hands were becoming numb and clumsy, making it difficult for her to operate the digitization equipment. Her speech was becoming slightly slurred, and she was having trouble concentrating on complex tasks. Marcus and Robert were also showing signs of cold exposure, though their military training had given them better tolerance for harsh conditions. I was struggling with the emotional weight of our situation as much as the physical hardships. Every document we could not save felt like a personal failure. Every system that failed felt like another step toward disaster. The knowledge that our government had planned for this catastrophe while keeping it secret from the public made the loss feel even more tragic. We were watching American democracy die in real time, both literally and figuratively. On day 35, we received the final communication from any official source. It was a brief emergency broadcast from a FEMA station in Virginia, transmitted on emergency frequencies. The message stated that all government facilities in the Washington metropolitan area were being abandoned due to unsafe conditions. Any remaining personnel were instructed to evacuate immediately to designated emergency shelters in the South. No further official communications would be transmitted until normal operations could resume. The message was followed by a list of emergency shelter locations, but most of them were hundreds of miles away in states that were also experiencing severe weather conditions. The suggested evacuation routes passed through areas that had been abandoned weeks earlier. The emergency shelters themselves were described as temporary facilities with limited capacity and supplies. It was clear that the government was not offering real assistance, but rather making a final gesture to document that they had attempted to help. Dr. Chen, Marcus, Robert, and I gathered in my office that evening to discuss our situation. We had digitized thousands of critical documents and created multiple backup copies. We had discovered the Operation Deep Freeze files and preserved evidence of the government's betrayal. We had pushed our equipment and ourselves to the absolute limit of endurance, but we had also reached the point where staying longer would likely mean death. The building was no longer habitable by any reasonable standard. The temperature was below freezing throughout the facility. The heating systems had failed completely. Our food supplies were nearly exhausted. We had no communication with the outside world except for increasingly sporadic emergency broadcasts. Most importantly, we were all showing signs of hypothermia and cold-related health problems that would only worsen if we remained. Marcus made the argument for immediate evacuation. He pointed out that we had already exceeded our original mission by weeks. We had preserved far more than anyone could have reasonably expected under the circumstances. The physical documents we were trying to protect were likely already damaged beyond repair by the extreme cold. Our priority now should be preserving ourselves and the digitized records we had created. Dr. Chen was more conflicted about leaving. She understood the practical arguments for evacuation, but she was still struggling with the idea of abandoning the original Constitution and Declaration of Independence. These documents had survived the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, 2 world wars, and countless other crises. The idea that they would be destroyed by a volcanic winter during our watch was almost unbearable. Robert took a different approach to the decision. He suggested that we focus on the bigger picture of what we had accomplished and what we still needed to do. We had preserved the most critical government information in digital form. We had discovered evidence of massive government corruption and betrayal. We had created a comprehensive record of how the crisis had unfolded. Our next responsibility was to survive long enough to share this information with other survivors and help them rebuild. I found myself torn between competing responsibilities and emotions. My professional duty as an archivist was to protect the historical documents in my care, even at the cost of my own life. My personal commitment to preserving the truth about what had happened during the crisis meant that I needed to survive long enough to share what I had learned. My loyalty to Dr. Chen, Marcus, and Robert meant that I could not ask them to die for my professional obligations. The decision was made for us on day 37 when the final backup generator failed. We lost all electrical power in the building, which meant we also lost the last vestiges of heating and lighting. The building became completely dark except for emergency flashlights and chemical light sticks. The temperature began dropping even faster without any mechanical heating. We had perhaps hours before the building became lethal. I made one final trip through the main archive storage areas using emergency lighting. The sight was heartbreaking. Centuries of American history were slowly being destroyed by the extreme cold. Paper documents were becoming brittle and cracking. Leather bindings were shrinking and warping. Metal components were contracting and breaking. The special protective cases that housed the Constitution and Declaration of Independence were showing signs of stress and potential failure. I spent several minutes standing in front of the Constitution case, trying to memorize every detail of the document that had defined American democracy for over 2 centuries. I understood that this might be the last time anyone would see these documents intact. The volcanic winter would likely continue for years, and the building would not survive without heating and climate control. When the crisis finally ended, future archaeologists might find fragments and pieces, but the complete documents would be gone forever. Dr. Chen found me in the storage area around 10 o'clock that evening. She did not say anything, but she understood what I was doing. We stood together in the darkness, looking at the documents that had brought us together and that we were now forced to abandon. The moment felt like attending a funeral for American history itself. We spent our final night in the National Archives, gathering our essential supplies and preparing for evacuation. We collected all of our digitized records and emergency equipment. We sealed the building as securely as possible and activated the emergency preservation protocols that might provide some minimal protection for the remaining documents. We documented our final actions and left detailed records of what we had accomplished and why we were leaving. Marcus used his knowledge of military evacuation procedures to plan our route out of the building and away from the Washington metropolitan area. The Operation Deep Freeze files had provided us with maps of supply depots and safe houses that we could potentially reach on foot. The emergency communication frequencies might allow us to contact other survivors. Most importantly, we now had information that could be invaluable for surviving in the frozen world outside. As dawn broke on day 38, we made our final preparations to leave the National Archives. The building that had been our home and workplace for over a month was now a frozen tomb. The documents we had devoted our lives to protecting were slowly being destroyed by forces beyond our control. The government we had served had abandoned us and left us to die. But we were still alive, and we had preserved more than anyone could have expected under the circumstances. We had evidence of the greatest betrayal in American history. We had maps and information that could help other survivors. We had digital copies of thousands of critical documents. Most importantly, we had each other and the determination to survive long enough to bear witness to what we had experienced. The weight of leaving was crushing, but the weight of staying would have been death. As we prepared to step out into the frozen wasteland that America had become, I made a promise to myself and to the documents we were leaving behind. If we survived, I would make sure that the world knew what had happened here. I would preserve the memory of American democracy, even if I could not preserve its physical foundation. I would document the collapse and the betrayal and the fight for survival that would define the next phase of human history. Day 60 brought the choice I had been dreading. Dr. Chen was dying, our last generator had failed, and ice was forming inside the document vaults. I had to decide whether to die protecting the past or live to document the future. What I chose next would determine not just our survival, but the survival of anyone we might encounter in the frozen wasteland America had become. The moment I made the choice to leave the National Archives, everything changed. It was not just abandoning a building, or even abandoning the documents I had spent my career protecting. It was accepting that the world we had known was gone forever, and that our only responsibility now was to survive long enough to bear witness to what we had experienced. Dr. Chen was unconscious when we carried her out of the building on the morning of day 38. Her hypothermia had progressed to the point where she could no longer walk or speak coherently. Marcus and Robert had fashioned a makeshift stretcher from archive storage materials, and we took turns carrying her as we made our way through the frozen streets of College Park. The weight of her body and the weight of our equipment made every step a struggle, but leaving her behind was not an option. The world outside the National Archives was almost unrecognizable. 3 weeks of sub-freezing temperatures had transformed the Washington metropolitan area into an Arctic wasteland. Ice covered every surface. Snow drifts blocked most roads. Abandoned vehicles were scattered everywhere, their owners having fled on foot when the roads became impassable. The silence was complete except for the sound of our footsteps crunching through the snow and the occasional crack of ice expanding on building facades. Most disturbing was the complete absence of other people. College Park had been home to over 30,000 residents, but the streets were empty. Emergency shelters had been established in the first weeks of the crisis, but they had been overwhelmed and abandoned as temperatures continued to drop. The few buildings that showed signs of recent habitation were already being reclaimed by ice and snow. It was like walking through a city of the dead. I had memorized the locations of the nearest supply depots from the Operation Deep Freeze files before we left the archives. The closest facility was supposed to be hidden in a maintenance building at Andrews Air Force Base, about 15 miles southeast of our location. The files indicated that it contained emergency food, medical supplies, cold weather gear, and communication equipment. More importantly, it was supposed to have heating systems that could provide temporary shelter while we planned our next move. The journey to Andrews took us 3 days of brutal travel through frozen suburban neighborhoods. We had to navigate around blocked roads, abandoned vehicles, and ice-covered obstacles. We took shelter in empty houses during the worst weather, breaking into basements and using emergency heating tablets to create minimal warmth. Dr. Chen remained unconscious for most of the journey, and I was becoming increasingly worried that we would lose her before we could find proper medical care. Marcus proved invaluable during this phase of our survival. His military training had included extensive cold weather operations, and he knew how to move efficiently through hostile terrain while carrying heavy loads. He also had experience with emergency medical care and was able to monitor Dr. Chen's condition and provide basic treatment for her hypothermia. Without his expertise, none of us would have survived the journey. Robert struggled more with the physical demands of the travel, but his determination was remarkable. He had never experienced anything like the conditions we were facing, but he refused to give up or slow down the group. He took his share of carrying Dr. Chen and the equipment, and he maintained a positive attitude even when the situation seemed hopeless. His resilience became an inspiration for all of us during the darkest moments of the journey. On day 41, we reached the perimeter of Andrews Air Force Base. The base was officially closed and abandoned, but the Operation Deep Freeze files had provided us with access codes and detailed maps of the hidden supply depot. Getting through the perimeter fence required cutting through frozen chain link with tools we had brought from the archives, but Marcus knew how to breach security barriers without triggering alarm systems that were probably no longer functional anyway. The supply depot was located exactly where the files indicated, hidden beneath a maintenance building near the old runway systems. The entrance was concealed behind a false wall that required a specific sequence of access codes to open. When we finally gained entry, we found ourselves in a sophisticated underground facility that had been designed to support emergency operations for months. The depot contained everything the Operation Deep Freeze files had promised and more. There were cases of military ready-to-eat meals with heating systems that could provide hot food for the first time in weeks. There were medical supplies including antibiotics, IV fluids, and emergency heating blankets that could help treat Dr. Chen's hypothermia. There were cold, weather clothing and sleeping bags rated for extreme temperatures. Most importantly, there was a diesel generator system that could provide heat and electrical power. I spent our first night in the depot reading through the facility's operation manual and communications equipment. The depot was equipped with radio systems that could reach other supply locations and potentially contact other survivors. The manual contained detailed information about the network of hidden facilities and the procedures for coordinating between them. It also contained disturbing information about the intended use of these depots during the crisis. According to the operational documents I found, the supply depots were never intended to support civilian survivors. They had been designed to maintain government personnel and essential workers during the transition period when society collapsed and the population was reduced to manageable levels. The supplies were calculated based on supporting predetermined numbers of authorized personnel, not random survivors who happened to discover the locations. This raised serious moral questions about our use of the facility. We were essentially stealing supplies that had been intended for government officials and their families. But we were also government employees who had been abandoned by our superiors and left to die. The supplies we were using had been stockpiled with taxpayer money for the purpose of maintaining government operations during exactly the kind of crisis we were experiencing. Dr. Chen regained consciousness on our second day in the depot. The combination of warmth, hot food, and medical supplies had stabilized her condition enough for her to speak and move around with assistance. Her first coherent words were questions about the archives and whether we had been able to save the documents. When I explained what we had accomplished and what we had been forced to abandon, she cried for several hours. The emotional toll of our experience was becoming as challenging as the physical hardships. We had all devoted our careers to preserving American history and culture. Watching centuries of irreplaceable documents slowly freeze to death had been traumatic in ways that were difficult to express. The knowledge that our own government had planned for this disaster, while keeping it secret from the public, made the loss feel like a deliberate betrayal rather than a natural catastrophe. Marcus spent those days monitoring the radio frequencies and trying to establish contact with other survivors. The communication equipment in the depot could reach emergency frequencies across the eastern United States, but most channels were silent or filled with automated distress signals from abandoned facilities. Occasionally, we would hear brief transmissions from other survivors, but they were usually too distant or too brief to establish meaningful contact. On day 44, We made contact with a group of survivors at a FEMA facility in Virginia. They had been monitoring emergency frequencies and heard our transmissions from the depot. The group included several federal employees who had been abandoned when their facility was evacuated, along with civilian refugees who had been sheltering at the FEMA station when communications were cut off. The Virginia group confirmed what we had suspected about the broader situation. The federal government had evacuated to underground bunkers and was maintaining communications through secure networks that excluded civilian survivors. Emergency shelters across the country had been overwhelmed and then abandoned as temperatures continued to drop. Millions of people were dead or missing, and organized relief efforts had ceased completely. More disturbing was their information about social breakdown in the areas that had not been completely evacuated. In regions where some infrastructure remained functional, violent competition for resources had become common. Groups of survivors were fighting each other for access to food, fuel, and shelter. The normal social order had collapsed, and survival had become a matter of individual or small group self-sufficiency. The Virginia group also had information about other government facilities and supply depots. They had discovered several locations using information similar to what we had found in the Operation Deep Freeze files. Some of the facilities had already been looted by other survivors, but many remained intact and could provide resources for extended survival. They were planning to establish a network of survivor communities based around these government facilities. This conversation changed our understanding of our situation and our options. We were not just four isolated individuals trying to survive a natural disaster. We were part of a larger community of abandoned government employees and civilian refugees who had access to critical information and resources that could help larger numbers of people survive the crisis. Our knowledge of government installations and emergency procedures made us valuable to other survivor groups. I made the decision to share the Operation Deep Freeze files with the Virginia group and anyone else we could contact. The information about supply depot locations, communication frequencies, and government bunker complexes was too important to keep secret. If the government had planned to abandon the civilian population, then civilian survivors had a moral right to use government resources to stay alive. Dr. Chen supported this decision, but she also raised important questions about the long-term implications. If we shared the locations of government supply depots, they would be quickly depleted by other survivors. If we revealed the locations of government bunkers, we might provoke retaliation from the officials hiding inside them. We needed to balance immediate survival needs against long-term strategic considerations. Marcus and Robert were more focused on practical concerns. They pointed out that staying in one location for too long would be dangerous, regardless of how well supplied it was. Other survivors would eventually discover the depot and might not be friendly. The heating systems were consuming fuel that would eventually run out. Most importantly, winter was just beginning, and temperatures would likely continue to drop for months. We spent the next several days planning our next move while monitoring communications from other survivor groups. The picture that emerged was both encouraging and terrifying. There were thousands of survivors scattered across the country, many with access to government facilities and emergency supplies. But there was also increasing evidence of violence and social breakdown as resources became scarcer and competition intensified. The Virginia group had established contact with survivor communities in North Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Each community was centered around a different type of government facility, including military bases, emergency management centers, and supply depots like the one we were occupying. They were beginning to coordinate resource sharing and mutual assistance, but they were also reporting increasing pressure from hostile survivor groups. On day 48, our situation changed dramatically when we detected radio transmissions from what appeared to be an official government source. The transmissions were encrypted and used communication protocols that matched the Operation Deep Freeze files. The signals were coming from somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, which was where the files had indicated the primary government bunker complex was located. I spent hours trying to decode the transmission using information from the Operation Deep Freeze files. The messages appeared to be routine operational communications between government facilities. They discussed supply distributions, personnel movements, and security concerns. Most disturbing was their casual references to population reduction targets and timeline projections for reestablishing government control over survivor communities. The transmissions confirmed our worst fears about the government's intentions. They were not planning to provide assistance to civilian survivors. Instead, they were waiting for the crisis to reduce the population to what they considered manageable levels. They viewed the volcanic winter as an opportunity to restructure American society according to their predetermined plans. The millions of people who were dying were not victims of a natural disaster, but casualties of a deliberate policy decision. Dr. Chen was horrified by the implications of what we were hearing. She had spent her career working for the federal government and had believed that public service meant helping American citizens during times of crisis. The realization that her own government was actively allowing millions of people to die for political purposes was almost impossible for her to accept. Marcus had a different reaction to the discovery. His military experience had taught him that governments sometimes made brutal decisions during wartime, but he had never imagined that the American government would implement such policies against its own citizens during peacetime. He began talking about the need to organize resistance against what he called an illegitimate government that had abandoned its constitutional responsibilities. Robert was more practical in his response. He pointed out that, regardless of the moral implications, we now had intelligence about government operations that could be valuable to other survivor communities. We knew where the government bunkers were located, what communication frequencies they were using, and what their operational plans involved. This information could help civilian survivors avoid government forces and coordinate their own resistance efforts. The decision to actively oppose the government was not one that any of us made lightly. We had all sworn oaths to serve the United States and to preserve its democratic institutions. But we had also sworn to serve the American people, and the government had clearly abandoned that responsibility. The documents and communications we had discovered proved that the current administration was operating outside constitutional authority and in direct opposition to the welfare of American citizens. On day 50, we made contact with a larger network of survivor communities that had been organized by former military personnel and federal employees. They called themselves the Constitutional Resistance, and they were dedicated to preserving democratic government and protecting civilian survivors from both the natural disaster and government oppression. They had been monitoring government communications and coordinating relief efforts across multiple states. The resistance confirmed much of what we had discovered independently. The federal government had implemented Operation Deep Freeze without congressional approval or public notification. They had abandoned millions of American citizens to die while preserving resources for a small group of political and military elites. They were planning to emerge from their bunkers after the crisis had killed most of the population and establish what amounted to a military dictatorship over the survivors. The resistance was working to establish alternative government structures based on constitutional principles and democratic accountability. They were organizing mutual aid networks, coordinating resource distribution, and preparing for eventual confrontation with the illegitimate federal government. They needed people with knowledge of government operations, access to official documents, and skills in preserving and communicating information. I realized that everything we had experienced and everything we had learned had been preparing us for this moment. We were not just random survivors trying to stay alive during a natural disaster. We were witnesses to the greatest constitutional crisis in American history, and we had evidence that needed to be preserved and shared. Our survival was not just personal anymore. It was essential for preserving the truth about what had happened and ensuring that future generations would know how American democracy had been betrayed by its own leaders. Dr. Chen, Marcus, Robert, and I made the decision to join the constitutional resistance and contribute our knowledge and skills to their efforts. We would leave the supply depot and travel to their main coordination center in the mountains of North Carolina. We would share the Operation Deep Freeze files and help establish communication networks between survivor communities. Most importantly, we would continue documenting what we experienced and preserving the evidence of government betrayal for future accountability. As we prepared to leave Andrews Air Force Base on Day 52, I reflected on how much our mission had changed since we first decided to stay behind at the National Archives. We had started as government employees trying to protect historical documents from a natural disaster. We had become witnesses to governmental betrayal and participants in a constitutional resistance movement. Our survival had evolved from personal necessity to historical imperative. The journey ahead would be dangerous and uncertain. We would be traveling through hostile territory where other survivor groups might view us as competitors for scarce resources. We would be risking capture by government forces who would consider us traitors for sharing classified information. We would be facing continued extreme weather conditions that were killing thousands of people every week. But we would also be carrying hope for the future of American democracy. The documents we had preserved and the evidence we had gathered could help ensure that the truth about this crisis would not be buried or forgotten. The networks we were joining could help protect civilian survivors and maintain democratic principles during the darkest period in our nation's history. The resistance we were supporting could eventually restore constitutional government and hold the responsible parties accountable for their crimes against the American people. Day 80 was when we found the bunker, not one of the government installations I had led us to, but something else entirely. Something that was not on any map I had ever seen. As we approached the entrance, I realized that everything I thought I knew about the government's preparation for this disaster was just the tip of the iceberg. What we found inside would change everything about how we understood the collapse of civilization. The bunker we discovered on Day 80 was hidden in the mountains of North Carolina, camouflaged so perfectly that we would have walked past it if Robert had not noticed an unusual pattern in the rock formations. What appeared to be natural stone was actually a sophisticated facade covering a massive steel entrance. The technology required to create such concealment was far beyond anything I had seen in the Operation Deep Freeze files, suggesting that this facility was part of an even more classified program. The entrance was secured with biometric scanners and access codes that were not listed in any government database I had memorized during my years at the National Archives. But the system had been damaged by the extreme cold, and Marcus was able to bypass the electronic locks using techniques he had learned during his military service. When the massive doors finally opened, we found ourselves looking into a facility that defied everything I thought I knew about government disaster preparedness. The bunker extended deep into the mountain, with multiple levels connected by elevator systems that were still functioning despite the global infrastructure collapse. Emergency lighting illuminated corridors lined with sophisticated equipment and living spaces that could house hundreds of people for years. The air was warm and clean, circulated by advanced filtration systems that were maintaining perfect environmental conditions while the world above froze to death. Dr. Chen was the first to realize what we were looking at. She had spent years working with government preservation systems, and she recognized technology that was decades ahead of anything used in civilian facilities. The climate control systems were maintaining museum-quality environmental conditions. The power systems were generating electricity through geothermal and nuclear sources that could operate independently for decades. The communication systems included satellite uplinks and encrypted networks that connected to facilities around the world. What we found in the first level of the bunker shattered my understanding of the government's preparation for the volcanic winter. There were detailed maps of not just American facilities, but bunker complexes in dozens of countries around the world. There were supply inventories that included resources sufficient to support thousands of people for decades. There were communication logs showing coordination between international governments that had apparently been planning for this crisis for years. The documentation we discovered revealed that Operation Deep Freeze had been just the American component of a global conspiracy involving governments, international organizations, and private institutions. The volcanic winter had not been an unexpected natural disaster, but an anticipated event that had been planned for and prepared for by a small group of global elites who intended to use the crisis to restructure human civilization according to their predetermined vision. Marcus found weapons storage areas that contained enough military equipment to outfit a small army. The weapons were not standard military issue, but advanced systems that appeared to be designed for post-crisis operations. There were vehicles specially designed for extreme weather operations, communication equipment for coordinating between bunker complexes, and even manufacturing facilities for producing additional supplies during extended isolation. Robert discovered living quarters that had been designed for specific individuals, with personal belongings and identification materials that revealed the intended occupants of the facility. The names included government officials, military leaders, corporate executives, and academic researchers, who had apparently been selected for survival based on their potential contributions to post-crisis reconstruction. The selection criteria were detailed in files that revealed disturbing assumptions about human worth and social value. I spent hours in the facility's archives, reading through documents that revealed the true scope of what had been planned. The volcanic winter was expected to kill between 60 and 80% of the global population within the first 5 years. The surviving population would be concentrated in regions with more favorable climates and would be dependent on the resources controlled by the bunker complexes. The new civilization that emerged would be structured around principles of scientific management and resource efficiency, rather than democratic governance and individual rights. The planners had studied historical precedents for population reduction and social restructuring. They had analyzed the Black Death, colonial conquests, world wars, and other events that had dramatically changed human societies. They had concluded that such events, while traumatic, often led to technological advances and social improvements that benefited the surviving populations. They viewed the volcanic winter as an opportunity to implement reforms that would have been impossible under normal democratic processes. Dr. Chen was horrified by the implications of what we were discovering. The documents revealed that the planners had not just anticipated the volcanic winter, but had actively worked to ensure that it would have maximum impact on civilian populations. They had deliberately withheld information about the threat, prevented the implementation of effective mitigation measures, and designed response plans that would maximize rather than minimize civilian casualties. The international coordination was particularly disturbing. Governments around the world had been secretly cooperating to ensure that the volcanic winter would achieve its intended demographic and social effects. Resources that could have been used to protect civilian populations had been diverted to bunker construction and elite preservation. Scientific research that could have provided early warning had been classified and suppressed. Emergency response capabilities that could have saved millions of lives had been deliberately degraded. Marcus discovered security protocols that revealed the bunker's intended defensive capabilities. The facility was designed not just to protect its occupants from natural disasters, but to defend against potential threats from survivor populations. There were automated weapons systems, perimeter defenses, and protocols for eliminating potential security risks. The planners had anticipated that civilian survivors might eventually discover bunker locations and had prepared to use lethal force to protect their resources. Robert found communication equipment that was still receiving transmissions from other bunker complexes around the world. The messages revealed that the global conspiracy was still active and coordinating its operations. Facilities in Europe, Asia, and other regions were reporting on local conditions, sharing resources, and planning for the eventual emergence from isolation. The scale of the coordination suggested that this was not an American conspiracy, but a truly global effort involving institutions and individuals from dozens of countries. The communication logs also revealed disturbing information about the current status of the crisis. The volcanic winter was proceeding exactly as the planners had anticipated. Population reduction targets were being met or exceeded in most regions. Infrastructure collapse was occurring on schedule. Social breakdown was following predicted patterns. The planners were expressing satisfaction with the progress of their long-term objectives. I realized that we had stumbled upon the operational headquarters for what amounted to the largest crime against humanity in recorded history. The documents and communication logs we were discovering provided irrefutable evidence that the volcanic winter had been planned and coordinated by a small group of international elites who viewed the majority of human population as expendable. They had not just failed to prevent a natural disaster, but had actively worked to maximize its devastating effects. The moral implications were staggering. Millions of people were dying from starvation, disease, and exposure, while the responsible parties lived comfortably in underground bunkers with abundant resources. Entire civilizations were collapsing, while the planners monitored the destruction and coordinated their response from positions of complete safety. Democratic governments had been subverted by conspirators who viewed democracy itself as an obstacle to efficient resource management. Dr. Chen, Marcus, Robert, and I spent the next several days systematically copying every document and communication log we could find. The evidence we were gathering would be crucial for eventually holding the responsible parties accountable and ensuring that the truth about the crisis would not be buried or forgotten. We created multiple backup copies and stored them in different locations throughout our equipment. The facility's manufacturing capabilities allowed us to produce additional storage devices and communication equipment that would help us share the information with other survivor communities. We also found medical supplies and equipment that helped us treat the health problems we had developed during months of exposure to extreme conditions. The bunker's resources gave us the first real opportunity to recover our strength and plan for long-term survival. On day 85, we made contact with the constitutional resistance using the bunker's communication equipment. The secure channels allowed us to share detailed information about our discoveries without risk of interception by government forces. The resistance confirmed that other survivor groups had discovered similar facilities and were beginning to piece together the scope of the global conspiracy. The resistance had been working to establish alternative governance structures and coordinate mutual aid between survivor communities. They were also preparing for eventual confrontation with the bunker complexes when the conspirators eventually emerged from hiding. The evidence we had gathered would be crucial for legitimizing resistance efforts and building international support for accountability measures. More importantly, the resistance had been developing plans for preserving democratic institutions and human rights during the Reconstruction period. They understood that the post-crisis world would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before the volcanic winter, but they were committed to ensuring that the new civilization would be based on democratic principles rather than the authoritarian efficiency preferred by the bunker planners. I realized that our role in this larger struggle was becoming increasingly important. We were not just witnesses to the crisis, but active participants in the fight to preserve human dignity and democratic governance. Our knowledge of government operations, our access to classified information, and our skills in preserving and communicating information made us valuable contributors to the resistance effort. Dr. Chen had evolved from a preservation specialist focused on protecting historical documents to a resistance operative dedicated to preserving human civilization itself. Her expertise in maintaining information systems and her knowledge of government procedures had become crucial for coordinating resistance activities and sharing intelligence between survivor communities. Marcus had transitioned from a security guard protecting government property to a military leader, helping to organize armed resistance against tyrannical authority. His military training and his understanding of security procedures had made him invaluable for planning operations against bunker complexes and protecting survivor communities from retaliation. Robert had grown from a young security officer following orders to a communications specialist, helping to maintain contact between resistance cells. His technical skills and his determination had made him essential for establishing and maintaining the networks that allowed survivor communities to coordinate their efforts. The bunker complex provided us with resources and capabilities that transformed our effectiveness as resistance operatives. We had access to advanced communication equipment that could reach survivor communities around the world. We had manufacturing facilities that could produce equipment and supplies needed for resistance operations. We had intelligence files that revealed the locations and capabilities of other bunker complexes. Most importantly, we had evidence that could expose the true nature of the crisis and the responsible parties to any survivors who lived through the volcanic winter. The documents and communication logs we had discovered proved beyond any doubt that the crisis had been planned and coordinated by international conspirators who viewed democratic governance and individual rights as obstacles to their vision of efficient resource management. Over the next several days, we established the bunker complex as a coordination center for resistance activities in the southeastern United States. We shared our intelligence with other survivor communities and helped them coordinate their own operations against local bunker complexes. We established communication links with international resistance groups and began sharing intelligence about the global scope of the conspiracy. The work was dangerous and exhausting, but it was also incredibly meaningful. We were not just trying to survive a natural disaster anymore, but working to preserve human civilization and democratic governance for future generations. Our survival had evolved from personal necessity to historical imperative to moral obligation. Dr. Chen established an archive within the bunker complex to preserve evidence of the crisis and the resistance efforts. She understood that future generations would need access to accurate information about what had happened and how human civilization had survived the greatest crisis in recorded history. Her work ensured that the truth would not be lost or distorted by the eventual victors. Marcus organized training programs for other survivors who wanted to join resistance operations. He taught them how to approach bunker complexes safely, how to gather intelligence without being detected, and how to coordinate with other resistance groups. His military expertise became the foundation for effective resistance operations across multiple states. Robert established communication networks that connected resistance groups across the continent and eventually around the world. He developed encryption protocols that protected sensitive communications from interception by bunker security systems. His work made it possible for isolated survivor communities to coordinate their efforts and share resources effectively. I focused on analyzing the intelligence we had gathered and developing strategic plans for long-term resistance operations. The documents we had discovered revealed not just the scope of the conspiracy, but the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of the bunker complexes. I identified potential targets for future operations and developed plans for disrupting the conspirators' ability to maintain control over survivor populations. By day 90, we had transformed from 4 isolated government employees trying to protect historical documents into leaders of a resistance movement that included thousands of survivors across multiple continents. The bunker complex had become a coordination center for operations that were beginning to threaten the conspirators' ability to maintain control over the post-crisis world. The volcanic winter was far from over. Temperatures were still dropping in most regions, and millions more people would die before the climate stabilized. Infrastructure would take decades to rebuild, and human civilization would never return to its pre-crisis form. But the resistance movement had ensured that the post-crisis world would not be controlled by the conspirators who had planned and coordinated the disaster. The evidence we had preserved would eventually be used to hold the responsible parties accountable for their crimes against humanity. The networks we had established would help coordinate reconstruction efforts based on democratic principles rather than authoritarian efficiency. The resistance we had organized would prevent the conspirators from emerging from their bunkers to claim control over survivor populations. Most importantly, we had ensured that the truth about the crisis would be preserved and shared with future generations. The archives we had established would provide accurate information about what had happened and why. The communication networks we had built would help prevent similar conspiracies from succeeding in the future. The resistance movement we had helped organize would serve as a foundation for rebuilding human civilization based on principles of democracy, human rights, and social justice. The Ice Age was not over. Winter was still coming, and it would continue for years. But now I knew something I did not know 90 days ago. Sometimes the most important thing you can preserve is not the past, but the future. And I had the maps to prove it. The documents we had saved, the evidence we had gathered, and the resistance we had organized would ensure that human civilization would survive not just the volcanic winter, but the conspiracy that had tried to use the crisis to reshape the world according to their authoritarian vision. The fight for the future of humanity had only just begun, but we had already won the most important battle. We had preserved the truth, and the truth would eventually set us free.